hear me? Is the microphone on? Yeah, if you would, that'd be killer. Thank you so much. I am wearing the mic, and I will disconnect it and give it to you. First, allow me to say thank you so very much. This is very exciting for me to see all these bright, shiny faces in here today. This is a thrill for me to share this project with you. My name is Kate Mielitz. I am a third-year PhD student in the Kansas State Personal Financial Planning Program on campus. It's Kate and our convicts. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart. And today, Dr. McDonald, my major professor, and I are going to be talking to you about a project, research that I conducted in Georgia last year with men and women who were incarcerated in the transitional centers in Georgia. Recent studies indicate the need for financial education for offenders who will be released back into society. In order to be most fully effective, we must first identify where knowledge exists. This research sought to identify what offenders knew so that a current curriculum could be further advanced to address financial topics that are relevant to transitioning offenders. Due to the number of changes we see every year in the financial industry, combined with the varying lengths of incarceration, I wanted to investigate topics that were relevant and could possibly inform financial success for offenders or former offenders at this point during and after reintegration to society. So, really quick lit review for you. First study of its kind came conducted in 2007 with men in a medium security prison in Wisconsin. And it was a sample of about 17 voluntary participants who took a financial knowledge course from her, a series of courses. About 17 respondents, and she used the Jumpstart instrument to do a pretest to find out what financial knowledge they had, and then she used the Jumpstart instrument to outline what her financial education curriculum was going to be. Scores ranged from as low as 37% to 90% on that pretest, and she determined based on that and the way that the curriculum went that Jumpstart was an absolutely appropriate instrument to use to formulate that foundational curriculum and to identify what is and is not needed in the prison system for offenders and financial literacy. Second project I'd like to bring your attention to is one that was published in 2013. It took place in a county jail, and Call and her team interviewed, I believe it was 13 inmates in a jail setting. So there is a difference between jail and prison, just so you know. Jail is less than 365 days. Prison is 365 days and greater, so there is a difference in terms of what they'll be. Jail typically has a quicker turnaround, but they went qualitative research from the inmate perspective. What did they, as inmates, self-identify as needing to know in terms of financial topics, and what did they think that other inmates also incarcerated with them needed to know as well? And there was determined to be a need not only for the things here, budgeting, savings, credit scores, and banking, but also owning their own business and starting things from scratch. And one inmate was even quoted as saying, "Most of us are in here because of money." Two of the most recent, in fact, the most recent publications that I was able to find were sprouted at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, sponsored by the Institute of Race and Ethnicity. A team of researchers conducted a study with inmates in Arkansas, and they wanted to really focus on racial differences in financial knowledge, but they took and they looked at offenders versus non-offenders. And they used the Lusardi and Mitchell's Big Five financial literacy questions that we will find in the National Financial Capability Study. And they used the non-offenders from the National Financial Capability Study versus the questionnaire that they used using those same Big Five questions in their instrument, and found that there is a difference in the financial knowledge between offenders and non-offenders. I just very quickly wanted to show you an example of 3 of those 5. For the interest rate question, approximately 1/3 of inmates got that answer correct, whereas 80% got it correct for non-offenders. The inflation question, not even half of offenders and almost 3/4 of non-offenders. And then the risk question, just a little over 1/3 got that one correct, whereas just over half got it correct for offenders, or for non-offenders, I'm sorry. Glidden and Brown, Gauchis all use the same data set, so they're taking some different angles Gouch is coming from an economics point of view, and Linden and Brown coming more from a criminal justice point of view. And what the point of this is, and what I am also trying to do, is really merge these fields of financial education, personal financial planning, and criminal justice. All right, so we'll talk here for just a second. This project that we've got right now on the screen is a project that I spoke about last year at the conference, about a financial education curriculum that I was presenting in the Transitional Center, in one of the Transitional Centers in Georgia. And it has just been through the review and revision process, so we've got our fingers crossed. And it investigated the effectiveness of the financial education curriculum for transitioning inmates in Georgia. And it is the first financial knowledge study with inmates that I have been able to identify that used a pre-test, post-test format surrounding the financial education treatment. So we were able to go in and measure what the financial knowledge was prior to incarceration, do the treatment, and then find out afterwards what did they learn, if anything. And we were very happy to find out that the curriculum did significantly increase financial knowledge of offenders. Now, this last piece of literature review is not directly connected to the incarcerated, but it is published in the Handbook of Consumer Finance Research 2016, Suzanne Bartholomé and Jonathan Fox from Iowa State University, and they are looking at the importance of financial knowledge in consumer financial decision making. They discuss how financial literacy education is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So while I'm talking about inmates, and I don't know, because I'm looking at Georgia specifically, I don't know if this is cross borders. Can we do this same thing for inmates in Alabama, inmates in Oregon, inmates in Illinois? But it's a good starting point. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that it's the needs assessment for the inmate population here, because before a program can begin, the needs assessment is that first step. So in my case, what do these men and women need to know prior to reintegration? And then also, because I am a PhD student and I've learned more and more that everything I need to do comes back to theory, I wanted to see in this, as I got these answers, was there anything that glimmered out there? Oh, if I had taken this angle with this theory, what more could I have investigated? What more could I have found? So this is the starting point, truly exploratory research. We don't know much, so what can we find out? Research of this kind is still in its infancy. We have no nationwide data that speaks to the financial knowledge of inmates. Most inmates will be reintegrated into society. They're not serving life terms. And in order to ensure that they are prepared to handle the financial decisions with which they will be faced, we must first identify what they do and do not know. This project served as a compulsory needs assessment for future financial education of inmates who are preparing to transition back into society, specifically within the state of Georgia. And additionally, with this research, I wanted to make sure that I had the theory put together. So I wanted to find out, with an established financial knowledge curriculum, or with financial knowledge, instrument, what is the financial knowledge of inmates within the transitional center system? Like I said, this overall topic is not well researched, and the articles that I mentioned are, in fact, the only research articles I was able to identify that spoke directly to financial knowledge in the incarcerated. Next, I wanted to identify how the curriculum I had developed needed to grow and be further developed in order to prepare those men and women for reintegration to society, as well as support educators who want to go out and work with this population. I wanted to collect a representative sample of inmates in the Georgia Transitional Center system. That was one of the goals of this. And I do want you to know, transitional centers do not exist in every state. Sometimes you'll find parallels with halfway houses, but the men and women in transitional centers are still under lock and key. They have to report, they're in cells, they go out, they work, they come back, it's a work release program. But not everybody has that opportunity. And the transitional centers primarily focus for reintegration purposes on substance abuse recovery, education, employment, and housing. And absolutely, we have to focus on those. There's lots of research to support it, but we also need to pay attention to how the resources of these former offenders are being used. Former offenders are not going to command a particularly large hourly wage on average, and they must make financial decisions from the moment they walk out the center's doors. Most of the time before they're released, they have to have an address. But when it comes to that max out date, they're out. So what decisions are they being faced with, and what kind of knowledge do they need to have in order to make fully informed decisions? And frankly, are they financially knowledgeable enough to make those decisions? The inmates that I taught, in particular at the Augusta Transitional Center, were not always familiar with the benefits of the banking system, how to fight identity theft, or how to build credit. These skills and knowledge do influence decisions that we make. Are we going to use a bank, a credit union, or a check cashing outfit? Are we going to open credit accounts and pay the minimum, pay nothing at all, pay more than the minimum? What are we going to do? And so these are all topics with which one needs familiarity as they begin their financial life. And I'm talking across the board, yes, specifically in this case, transitioning and starting their financial lives right out of prison, but it also parallels to those looking at starting their lives starting from high school or coming right out of college and getting ready to begin. And I also did want to expand on Koenig's assertion that the Jumpstart instrument is appropriate for measuring financial knowledge for this protected population. So I used a shortened version of the Jumpstart Coalition Financial Literacy Survey. And I did that because I wanted to measure financial knowledge based on things that I knew from practice, from working with those inmates, things that I knew that they needed to know, but also topics that research has shown are important to people who are developing financial literacy. Thirdly, more of a little stick out there, is I wanted to make sure I kept their attention the entire time and they committed going through it. The Jumpstart instrument has 31 questions, so I went further down and dirty quick, the things that I knew would address what we needed to address. Really quickly, I want to give you a snapshot. Literary support for the questions that I chose. Now, I mentioned already that Koenig said, hey, this is a great instrument to use, so you'll see her cited throughout here, but I wanted to provide some additional justification. And in terms of needing to know where it's safest to keep money. So is it safer in a bank or a credit union, in a sock drawer with a friend or family member? Call It All with her jail project talked about that. Heckman and Hanna in 2015 looked at individual factors related to low-income household savings behaviors, and this is a low-income population. I'm not saying that we don't have inmates throughout the country, and even in the group that I was working with, that have the higher incomes, but we're talking by and large, on average, we're talking lower income, close if not below poverty. Okay, and then needing to know how to budget in order to pay bills. You have a certain amount coming in, how do you allocate it so that you can make ends meet, possibly put some money away? Lyons, Chang, and Scherp back in 2006 looked at a way to translate financial education into behavior change, again, for the low-income population. Bronstein and Welch wrote a section for the Federal Reserve Bulletin where they identified the need to know how to effectively save over a long period of time. So is that going to be a savings account, a CD, the stock market, ding, ding, ding? You know, what is going to be the most effective way to grow money over the course of a long period? And also have familiarity with ways to pay for items. Okay, so if you've been locked up for 15, let's see, let me do the math here. Yeah, 15 years, you may not be familiar with debit cards. You're probably not going to be familiar with online banking and some of these bill pay options that we have. Now, the Jumpstart instrument does not speak directly to that, but just in the back of your mind, starting to think about some of these things that they'll need to know and what are ways that you can pay for items. Also understanding time value of money is just some of the basic. If the sooner you start, the more you're going to have. University of Illinois Extension has this amazing tool to teach compound interest that I'm really hoping that can be used in the future for people working with this population because it's hands-on and you can say, hey, I get this. Robin Woodyard looked for best practices. Now, they were talking about college students, but again, we come back to starting that financial life, making the connection between financial knowledge and best practices, and understanding what kind of insurance do I have to have in order to have my car protected. And then, of course, interest working on credit cards, knowing that paying only the minimum is going to put you farther and farther behind. And then we come down to the final couple of questions, drawing from Lusardi and Mitchell's 2006 article, where they really identified inflation and protecting purchasing power, and then Gauchis also targeted on that looking at, okay, these are men and women that have been locked up for a pretty long time in general. So they need to understand how the dollar might be a little bit different and how they may not be able to purchase as much anymore with that same dollar. And then what to do, not necessarily looking at it negatively, what do you do in case you're locked up again so you can protect your money, but just having that in mind that the way money works and what we can do with it has changed. Yep, nope, this is right. All right, so this is the fun stuff. And I'm going to try and keep on task because this is my favorite part of the project. What did I do? And I had this really terrific opportunity to go to all 13 transitional centers in the state of Georgia. Yes, I put 5,000 miles in 1 month on my car. I did the research over the course of 5 months. 13 transitional centers, and I went to 11 of them twice. Excuse me. The residents that I chose to participate in this were within 90 days of their tentative parole date or the tentative parole month or their max out date. And the reason that I chose those men and women was because I wanted them in a position where they were staring right in the face financial decisions that were coming, and they were being able to handle them in a timely manner. There was an incentive to participate, so they came in, and like I started saying, and before we got started, there was that awkward silence. What is this woman doing in here? And especially when they don't see women outside of uniform very often, it was, who, what? And so after the awkward silence was over, I introduced myself and I invited everybody to come grab a bag of chips or the treat, whatever it was, and a can of soda or a bottle of water. And I did that because I wanted them to know that I was hoping they would help, but regardless of whether or not they chose to participate, I appreciated their time. I appreciated their attendance. And I did say, as part of my introduction, when we're done, regardless of whether or not you participate, I'm going to be available for any questions and answers, any quick financial education that you're interested in, and this is about what you need. Yeah, I get something out of it, but what can I do for you? Now, I did do this in 2 phases. So there was the quantitative phase that I'm talking about today, and that was in-house collecting that instrument. There was a qualitative follow-up study for after release. And I do wonder if part of the reason I got the response that I did was because if you opted into phase 1, the quantitative, and you opted into phase 2 and participated in the follow-up interview, you were entered to win one of 10 $250 store gift cards. And so I think that made some connection. Now, for the actual instrument itself and for the informed consent form, we went through that and they were allowed to go through it at their own pace. But I also read those things out loud. I wanted to make sure that nobody had any confusion about what they were doing. This is a protected population. The IRB process is not a joke, but I wanted them to know that I was putting their interests first above and beyond my own. And the first group of men that I collected the data from were men that I had already taught. I started in Augusta, and I asked them first, I said, would any of you like me to read it out loud? And they're like, no, Ms. Kay, don't worry about it. And that was fine. I sat there staring at them awkwardly. But as they finished, and as I was driving home that night, I said, wait a second. These guys didn't. You know, I recognized them. I knew their familiarity with the written word and answering questions. But I said, there were men in here tonight that I have taught before that are not comfortable reading and writing. And so I said, forget this. I'm going to read it out loud every time going forward. And I got such positive nonverbal results. Nobody came up to me afterwards and said, oh, Miss Kate, thank you so much for reading that out loud. It made such a difference. But I did it so that, number 1, nobody had to ask. And number 2, everybody was able to participate that wanted to. And I saw men and women alike going through it, pacing themselves with what I was doing, which indicates to me that that was beneficial to them. So that was something that I definitely learned in this process. Okay. So demographics, total sample of 307. Final sample for this project was 269. Any missing data that I had was deemed to be random, and I list-wise deleted it, so I just didn't have to concern myself with it for this project. End results are just over 90% of the sample is male, and just under 10% is female. Now, in the transitional center system in Georgia, there are 2 women-only transitional centers, 11 for men. That works out to about a 13% women, 77% or 87%, I'm sorry, for men. So we're close. Now, this was absolutely convenient sample. I cannot speak to representativeness, but I can say this is the first study that has done men and women that I have been able to find, and I'm very, very excited about that. Age range from 22 to 71, with a mean age of just under 38 years old, and race, as would hold true for the state of Georgia, primarily black, and then less than, or just over a third identifies as not black or not African American. Demographics continue. So this is number of times incarcerated. One of the things that I definitely wanted to figure out was how many times have been incarcerated, what else might there be in there? And once was only 39%, so we have over 60% of the men and women that participated in this project having been incarcerated more than one time. Mean total time incarcerated was over 105 months, and if I'm remembering my math right, that's just a hair shy of, oh goodness, now I can't do math. That's a hair shy of 9 years. And the sample range of time incarcerated, you might be sitting here thinking, 1 month, what is she talking about? The transitional center system in the state of Georgia occasionally picks up people that are on parole or on probation who might need a little additional assistance or might need some incarceration to help them continue on the right path. And so I think what this really is connected to is I hit somebody right at the right time. They were within a tentative parole date, but they had only been locked back up for a short amount of time. And they can go directly to the transitional center rather than to prison to make that happen. All right, so just over half of our population has a high school diploma or general equivalency diploma, and about a quarter on each side above and below that. Prior to incarceration, over half of our sample was employed full-time, and 42% had a bank account prior to incarceration, and financial education, just barely over a quarter had taken financial education at any point in their lives. And I did ask whether that was transitional center, or that was high school or college, or any financial education class at all. So really quickly, before I turn it over to Dr. McDonald to talk about the multivariate analysis that we ran, I want to go through the financial knowledge results by question. So, safest place to keep savings, yes, by and large, people do know that the safest place to keep that is in the bank, but you know what, there's 6% that are uncomfortable or didn't agree with that statement. Reason to borrow money. That looks at what would be a reason to borrow money. The answer in that one was looking to if you need to buy a car in order to get a job. Budgeting, that was very much a math exercise. So they were given a dollar amount. Could they do the math to figure out how much they would have left in order to save money? Withholding, we're looking at almost a third of people not understanding what comes out of their paychecks. You know, what's withheld, savings, Social Security, Medicare, those types of things. Long-term savings, not understanding that going long-term, we're looking at stock market as opposed to a regular savings account. Time value of money, I'm just going to skip through a couple more on these. Interest on credit cards. Less than half understood that if you pay only the minimum payment, you're going to accumulate more and more interest. So the average total score was 58.46%. Now that for me as an educator within the transitional center system, that for me as a professional, that for me as a PhD student is very concerning. Pass was 8 out of 12, so we're not even asking for 80% on this. Less than 45% actually passed the financial knowledge exam. And so this has opened more questions for me, but before we get to the more questions, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McDonald to talk about the multivariate analyses that we ran. I will get your question, I promise. And we'll do questions after you. Okay, and so what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mack. He's going to talk about the multivariate analysis. I'll come back up and wrap us up. Seisha will draw this all together for us, and then we will be available for questions. So, Dr. Mack. Oh, yeah. Yes, I should probably start off. Sorry, guys. You're welcome, you are not on.
Thanks a lot. The reason I'm here is that Kate is perfectly capable of understanding and talking about this multivariate analysis. She did it. But this is a way to give her a break and get me involved a little bit. So this multivariate analysis uses a number of variables, many of which you've already seen in the description before, to try to understand our dependent variable, which is what was their total score correct out of the 12 questions. So someone might have got 5, someone might have got 10. You can see by the percentages before that there aren't going to be a lot of people who got very high scores. So we're looking from low to high on that. We are interested in what we consider control variables, or things just to make sure they're in the estimation: age, race, and gender. And then we had a number of variables that we started to think about as relating to human capital, the idea that people have an incentive to learn, to get formal education, on-the-job training, have experiences that can improve their lives in the future. So the general concept and the variables we're going to use is we have some indicators really of prior learning or experiences that might help them become more financially knowledgeable. Probably the best example of that, even though it's a low proportion who had it, is having some prior financial education in some formal way. We used a similar sort of theory or set of variables in the previous study, which looked at the pre-test and the post-test, and it worked out fairly well. If we have time at the end, Kate will get a chance to talk to you about searching for some other theories that are probably going to be more informative about how to change things. These are things that people already have. The idea is that they have an incentive to continue to learn, and that some of them are going to be more prepared than others to learn for the future as well. So, to review what those are again: education, formal education they've had, prior employment, the kind of employment or not that they might have had before they were incarcerated, prior financial education I mentioned, whether they had a banking account prior to incarceration, and then we also use the number of times incarcerated. In a way, you could think about that, or we could classify that as a demographic. It's a feature of them relative to the other people, but we thought it would be a way to get clued in on something related to recidivism, even though we're not claiming anything about what this might have as an impact, but it's obviously one of the reasons we're interested in this. So again, the concept is that these things, except for times incarcerated, having had prior educational experience, working relationship with a bank, are things that demonstrate interest and ability to learn, and maybe have something to do with what we might call specific financial knowledge or specific human capital in the jargon of that theory. Okay, so what I'll show you here is that we separated these variables out into two groups: the demographics, the human capital related variables, and we ran the analysis separately for them just to look at them as a group. And then we put them all together in a full model. So the way I'll go over this will be kind of repetitive, but I suppose the value of that in a way is that will help communicate what we found. So this one, looking at gender, age, and race, those of you who aren't familiar with looking at statistical tables, the ones with the asterisks on them are statistically significant effects. Those that we're pretty sure reveal that this is something that is not random, is one way to talk about that. So I'll talk about the things that didn't matter. Gender didn't matter. We were just listening to Anne-Maria Lasardi, or many of you were, where women were disadvantaged compared to men. That's not the case here for financial knowledge among this population. There's no statistically significant difference between those two. Age does not matter. Remember there, if you happen to notice, I can't remember whether Kate mentioned it, but the age range is pretty substantial here, from 21 to 77. So potentially you would think that that might make a difference in terms of some things that people might feel more confident to answer about or not, but it did not have any effect. The majority population in this group are African American or black, and that's significantly negatively associated with financial knowledge. So they, just looking at these variables alone, are much less likely to score high on the financial knowledge test. Looking at the other variables then, the human capital related ones, formal education and the number of times incarcerated turn out to be important. I'm going to talk about incarceration and the number of times about that in a minute and later on, but just talk now about these, what we think are learning-related variables. So having less than a high school education, which is about a quarter of the group, is you're much less likely to have good financial knowledge of the type you're tested for, which is not too surprising at all, but it shows up there. What surprised me personally a little bit is that I would have thought some of these other indicators, like having been employed full-time, prior financial education in particular, even though we don't know much at all about what that means. It could be a short course, it might have even been a college course in personal finance, could be anything, but it doesn't have a statistically significant effect, and neither does experience with formal banking in forms of having an account. The other statistically significant variable is that if you were incarcerated 2 times among this group as compared to just once or the other categories, it's positively associated with financial knowledge. And that's kind of puzzling. It is what it is. I'll return to that in a moment. Okay, so then we put them all together, which is typically what we do in these kinds of analyses. We separate things out. I think partly the reason we do that is to think of a few things at a time and what we expect, and to start to get meaning from what we're finding. And then if we put it all together, we have the potential that some variables that appear to be significant when they're tested in the presence of others will turn out not to be significant then, which will tell us that what we were seeing before was in a smaller model, perhaps with fewer variables, was not fully correct. So these are our final results, in other words. So it turns out that the story is pretty much the same as you've already heard. If you're black, you're less likely to have financial knowledge of the kind we tested for, or Kate tested for. If you have a less than high school or education, or don't have a GED, that's the largest negative association. So again, they're not as advantaged in terms of financial knowledge. And then it turns out that this being in an incarcerated for the second time still holds up and has a positive association. We've talked a couple times about ideas about how some experience with the prison system or whatever, but not too much, would have some sort of effect. Effects like this in analyses where it doesn't sort of go up smoothly with more experience or less experience are often hard to interpret, so we're not really even going to hazard a guess, but it's the kind of thing that's potentially interesting to think for the future about what it might mean or how we might reach people with more or less experience in the prison system.